There is something quietly unsettling about the world humanity is born into, not because it is overtly hostile or chaotic, but because it already functions with remarkable efficiency long before any individual understands their place within it, as though the mechanisms of reality were assembled in advance, and human beings were simply inserted into a structure that did not require their consent or comprehension in order to operate. From the moment of birth, systems are encountered fully formed: economic systems, social hierarchies, expectations of labor and productivity, and unspoken rules that govern survival, all of which are treated not as inventions but as natural conditions, leaving little room to question whether this world was shaped intentionally or merely inherited in a finished state. This is not how origin stories are usually told, because creation myths typically begin with chaos, divine will, or the emergence of order from nothingness. Yet what is striking about the human condition is that it does not feel like the beginning of a story at all, but rather like the continuation of one whose opening chapters have already been lost. Humanity does not awaken into the world asking why it exists, but instead spends its life learning how to function within an environment that assumes its participation by default, an environment that rewards compliance, endurance, and repetition, while rarely encouraging reflection on why these qualities are required in the first place. In the late 19th century, inside the quiet halls of the British Museum, this sense of inherited normality was briefly disrupted when a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith translated a series of ancient clay tablets excavated from Mesopotamia, texts that had remained unread for thousands of years, not because they were hidden, but because no one had yet taken the time to understand them. In 1872, Smith encountered a tablet that caused such visible excitement that witnesses later described him running through the museum in a state of emotional overwhelm, an episode that history would later frame as the dramatic discovery of the Great Flood narrative, a story familiar to modern audiences and easily absorbed into existing religious frameworks. Before we continue, feel free to share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I always find it grounding to see how these ancient stories resurface simultaneously across different places and time zones. And as always, the images you see here are only meant to provide atmosphere and context. Thank you for being here and for continuing this exploration with us. What is far less discussed is that the Flood tablet was not the only text Smith translated during that period, nor was it the most unsettling, because alongside it were other tablets that did not describe divine judgment or moral failure, but instead outlined something far more mundane and far more disturbing: the administration of labor, the burden of work, and the problem of maintaining a system that demanded continuous effort to sustain itself. These texts did not portray humanity as the culmination of creation or the favored children of the gods, but as a practical response to a logistical crisis, a solution introduced into a world that already existed and already required maintenance. The language used in these tablets is notably devoid of reverence, reading less like spiritual myth and more like internal documentation, as though the authors were not attempting to inspire worship but to preserve memory, recording events as they understood them rather than reshaping them into moral allegory. The beings described within these texts, later known as the Anunnaki, were not depicted as abstract forces of nature or distant cosmic symbols, but as entities with physical needs and limitations who ate, slept, argued, failed, and most importantly, worked until the work itself became unsustainable. According to these records, the crisis that preceded humanity's appearance was not one of creation, but of labor. A breakdown in the system caused by those tasked with the heaviest burdens refusing to continue, leading to instability that could not be resolved through force alone. It is at this point in the narrative that human beings enter the story, not as heroes or chosen creations, but as replacements, introduced after something had gone wrong, in much the same way tools are developed when existing methods fail to meet demand. This detail is easy to overlook precisely because it is not dramatic, as there is no thunderous arrival, no declaration of purpose, and no celebration of human uniqueness, only the quiet insertion of a new component into an already functioning mechanism. Humanity is described not as an end, but as a means, and this distinction is critical because it reframes the entire question of origin away from meaning and toward function. The Sumerian texts do not emphasize worship or devotion, but organization, hierarchy, and limitation, carefully outlining the boundaries within which humans are expected to operate, including shortened lifespans, constrained knowledge, and an inherent dependence on labor for survival. These limitations are not framed as punishment or moral consequence, but as design parameters, suggesting that humanity was engineered not for freedom, but for reliability, predictability, and endurance within a system that required constant upkeep. What makes this perspective deeply unsettling is not the implication of gods, advanced beings, or forgotten civilizations, but the implication of intentional design itself, because design implies purpose, and purpose implies that the world humanity inhabits may not be neutral, but structured in a way that benefits some functions while obscuring others. A system that operates through parameters rather than force does not need to impose control overtly, because its participants internalize their roles, mistaking necessity for inevitability and structure for nature. If this interpretation is even partially accurate, then the most important question is not who designed humanity, but why humanity does not remember being designed at all, because forgetting is not merely the absence of knowledge, but a condition that serves a function. A system is most stable when its participants believe it is natural, when they do not imagine alternatives, and when they accept their roles as unavoidable rather than imposed. This is the condition humanity finds itself in today, maintaining systems it did not create, sustaining structures whose origins are rarely questioned, and expending enormous amounts of energy simply to continue existing within a world that demands constant effort without explaining why that effort is required. The Sumerian tablets do not ask modern readers to worship the past or to accept a single interpretation of history, but they do present a possibility that is difficult to dismiss, that what we call history may be little more than residue, fragments of a much older story whose beginning has been deliberately forgotten. If humanity was designed to serve in a world that forgot its true origin, then forgetting was not a failure of memory, but a feature of the system itself, ensuring that those who maintain it never question why it exists or whom it ultimately serves. This is where the investigation truly begins, not with gods or extraterrestrials, but with the unsettling realization that the world humanity inherited may have been complete long before humans arrived, and that the greatest mystery is not what created us, but why we were taught not to remember. When modern history introduces Sumer, it often does so with a tone of origin, presenting it as the first civilization to rise from human simplicity into complexity, the place where writing, law, mathematics, and organized society supposedly began. Yet when the actual records left behind by the Sumerians are examined without the expectation of primacy, a very different impression emerges, one that does not resemble a culture discovering itself for the first time, but rather one inheriting a structure whose foundations were already laid long before they arrived. The earlier Sumerian texts do not read like the writings of people inventing systems from scratch. There is no extended explanation of trial and error, no prolonged period of experimentation recorded in clay, and no sense of gradual discovery. Instead, writing appears fully formed. Numerical systems arrive with precision, legal codes emerge already standardized, and astronomical knowledge is presented not as speculation, but as reference. This sudden completeness is difficult to reconcile with the idea of organic cultural development, especially when compared to later civilizations, whose growth is clearly marked by centuries of refinement and revision. What the Sumerians left behind suggests not a beginning, but a continuation. Their texts repeatedly imply that the knowledge they possessed was not originally theirs, that it had been received, preserved, and passed down rather than created. Kings are described not as founders of order, but as stewards of it, tasked with maintaining laws and practices that already existed. The language of invention is largely absent, replaced by the language of inheritance and responsibility. This distinction becomes even more striking when examining the way the Sumerians described their gods. In many mythological traditions, deities exist as distant symbolic forces embodying abstract principles. But in Sumerian records, the Anunnaki are portrayed with an unusual degree of specificity and physicality. They occupy places, they perform tasks, they require rest, and they engage in disputes that resemble administrative conflicts more than divine dramas. They are not omnipresent creators shaping reality from nothing, but actors operating within an already defined environment. Rather than presenting the Anunnaki as the source of existence itself, the texts position them as authorities within a system, beings who oversee, manage, and regulate processes that must continue functioning in order for stability to be maintained. This is a subtle but crucial difference because it reframes the relationship between gods and humans away from worship and toward utility. Humanity does not appear in these narratives as a sacred creation made in the image of divine perfection, but as a subordinate presence introduced to fulfill specific needs. Even the Sumerian king list, often cited as a foundational historical document, reinforces this sense of inheritance rather than origin. The list begins with rulers whose reigns stretch across impossibly long spans of time, a detail that is frequently dismissed as symbolic or exaggerated. Yet from the Sumerian perspective, these lengths of rule were not metaphors but records. The text does not attempt to justify them or explain them away, suggesting that the audience for whom it was written did not find them implausible. What follows these ancient reigns is not the birth of civilization, but its reduction. Lifespans shorten, authority fragments, memory compresses. The structure remains, but its scale diminishes, as though the system itself persists while those operating within it become increasingly limited. This pattern is consistent across Sumerian records and reinforces the idea that their civilization existed within the shadow of something older, something larger that had already declined. The Sumerians themselves seemed acutely aware of this imbalance. Their texts are filled with laments about loss, decline, and distance from an earlier age when gods walked openly among humans and knowledge flowed more freely. These laments are not framed as poetic nostalgia, but as genuine expressions of disconnection, as though the writers sensed that they were living in the aftermath of a much greater order whose logic they no longer fully understood. This awareness is critical because it suggests that the Sumerians did not see themselves as the pinnacle of human achievement. They did not believe they had reached the height of progress. Instead, they viewed their world as diminished, constrained, and operating under stricter limits than before. Their role was not to expand endlessly, but to preserve what remained, to maintain fragments of a system whose original design was no longer accessible. In this context, Sumer begins to resemble not the birthplace of civilization, but its caretaker. A culture tasked with keeping records alive after the architects were gone. This perspective explains why Sumerian texts focus so heavily on lists, measurements, boundaries, and duties rather than exploration or innovation. Their attention was directed toward maintenance, not expansion. If this interpretation is correct, then Sumer did not stand at the dawn of history, but at a turning point where memory began to fade and responsibility replaced understanding. They were not discovering how the world worked, but attempting to keep it functioning with incomplete knowledge. This would also explain why their writings feel administrative rather than inspirational, practical rather than visionary, as though they were documenting instructions rather than expressing beliefs. Seen this way, the significance of Sumer lies not in what it created, but in what it preserved. Its tablets do not tell the story of humanity learning to build a world, but of humanity inheriting one. A world that already had rules, hierarchies, and expectations built into its structure, long before humans fully understood their place within it. This raises a question that modern history rarely considers. If Sumer did not begin at the beginning, then what came before it? And more importantly, why does the record of that earlier world feel so fragmented, so procedural, and so strangely unconcerned with human meaning? To answer that, it becomes necessary to examine the problem that existed before humanity appeared at all, the problem that made human beings necessary in the first place. Before humanity appears in the Sumerian narrative, the world described by the tablets is already active, structured, and burdened by a problem that has nothing to do with creation and everything to do with maintenance. The texts do not begin with an empty earth waiting to be shaped, but with an environment that holds value, resources, and strategic importance. An environment that must be worked in order to remain viable. What emerges from these records is not a story about bringing life into existence, but about sustaining a system that has begun to strain under its own demands. The Anunnaki are introduced not as distant creators observing their work from afar, but as participants embedded within this system, responsible for tasks that are physically demanding and repetitive. The tablets describe extensive labor involving the manipulation of land, the digging of channels, and the extraction of materials from the earth, all of which are framed as necessary for the stability of a broader structure that extends beyond the planet itself. This labor is not portrayed as symbolic or ritualistic, but as continuous and exhausting, carried out over vast spans of time. Over time, the burden becomes unsustainable. The texts recount a growing unrest among a group often referred to as the younger gods, those assigned to the heaviest and most monotonous tasks. Their dissatisfaction does not manifest as abstract rebellion or moral protest, but as a practical refusal to continue working under conditions that no longer serve their interests. They abandon their tools, surround the dwellings of their overseers, and force a confrontation that threatens to destabilize the entire operation. What is striking about this moment is how familiar it feels. The conflict is not framed as a battle between good and evil, but as a labor dispute, a breakdown in the relationship between those who benefit from a system and those who are required to maintain it. The response to this crisis is equally pragmatic. Rather than escalating the conflict or dismantling the system, the leaders convene to discuss alternatives, searching for a solution that preserves functionality while reducing resistance. It is within this context that humanity is first mentioned. Not as a vision, not as a gift, but as a proposal. The idea is introduced quietly, almost cautiously, as a way to offload the burden of labor onto a new class of beings who would be capable of performing the required tasks without the same capacity for refusal. This proposal does not arise from compassion or curiosity, but from necessity. The system must continue operating, and the current workforce is no longer willing to comply. The language surrounding this decision is telling. There is no celebration of innovation, no philosophical debate about the ethics of creation, only a focus on outcomes and efficiency. Humanity is conceived not as an equal participant, but as a functional component designed to absorb the strain that threatens to fracture the existing hierarchy. This framing shifts the entire narrative of human origins away from destiny and toward utility. What follows in the texts is not a single act of creation, but a process marked by trial, error, and adjustment. Early attempts fail. The beings produced are incomplete, unstable, or incapable of fulfilling their intended role. These failures are recorded matter-of-factly, without emotional investment, as though documenting prototypes that did not meet operational requirements. Only after repeated refinement does a version emerge that satisfies the needs of the system. This process reveals something essential about the nature of humanity's introduction into the world. Humans were not created because the world lacked life, but because the system lacked compliance. They were engineered to endure work, to reproduce reliably, and to operate within defined limits that reduce the likelihood of rebellion. In other words, humanity was designed to be sustainable, not autonomous. The texts emphasize that once this new solution was implemented, the original laborers were relieved of their burdens. The system stabilized. Order was restored. Humanity took on the work that others had refused, maintaining the flow of resources and allowing the hierarchy above them to continue functioning with minimal disruption. From the perspective of the system, the problem had been solved. What is absent from these accounts is any indication that humanity was informed of its role. There is no suggestion that humans were made aware of the circumstances of their creation or the reason for their existence. Instead, they are placed directly into the environment, assigned tasks, and allowed to reproduce, ensuring a self-sustaining workforce that would persist without requiring further intervention. This omission is significant because it suggests that memory itself was never part of the design. A being that understands why it exists may eventually question whether it should continue to exist under those conditions. A being that does not remember its origin, however, is far more likely to accept its role as natural and unavoidable. In this sense, forgetting is not an accident of time, but an integral part of the solution. Seen through this lens, humanity's emergence is not a mystery of cosmic origin, but the outcome of a very specific problem and a very specific response. The system required labor that would not rebel, maintenance that would not demand explanation, and continuity that would not depend on awareness. Humanity fulfilled those requirements. This reframing alters the entire meaning of human history. Instead of asking how humans rose from primitive beginnings to build civilization, the more unsettling question becomes whether civilization itself was inherited as a working environment, one that humans were introduced into without understanding its purpose. If humanity was created to solve a problem, then the nature of that problem may hold the key to understanding why human life is structured around work, limitation, and repetition. And if the system that required humanity still exists, then it becomes necessary to ask whether the problem was ever truly resolved, or whether it simply found a more efficient way to continue. If humanity was introduced as a solution to a systemic problem, then the nature of that solution can be examined not through what humans were given, but through what they were denied. The Sumerian texts do not describe humanity as incomplete by accident, but as deliberately constrained, shaped to operate within narrow boundaries that ensure reliability and reduce the likelihood of disruption. These constraints are not framed as punishments or moral consequences, but as inherent conditions of human existence, so deeply embedded that they appear natural rather than imposed. One of the most obvious limitations is time. Human lifespan, when compared to the beings described in the earliest tablets, is remarkably short. The King List records rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before a sharp decline reduced human lives to spans that barely allow the accumulation of long-term memory or sustained authority. This reduction is never explained within the texts, nor is it treated as tragic. It is simply recorded as though longevity were a variable that had been adjusted. A being that does not live long enough to fully understand the system it inhabits is unlikely to challenge it, and a society built on short lives must constantly focus on survival rather than reflection. Alongside this temporal limitation is a cognitive one. Humans are capable of remarkable intelligence, yet that intelligence is fragmented, distributed unevenly, and constrained by narrow sensory ranges. Human perception occupies only a small fraction of the available spectrum of reality, leaving vast amounts of information inaccessible without tools or mediation. This limited awareness creates a dependency on external structures for interpretation and meaning, reinforcing the tendency to accept established narratives rather than question their foundations. The necessity of labor is another defining parameter of the human condition. Survival requires continuous effort, repetition, and cooperation within structured systems, leaving little room for sustained autonomy. Work is not optional, nor is it framed as temporary. It is a permanent feature of existence, one that consumes the majority of human time and energy. This requirement is often justified as a natural consequence of life on Earth, yet within the context of the Sumerian narrative, it begins to resemble a design choice, ensuring that humans remain occupied with maintenance rather than inquiry. Fear also plays a critical role in shaping human behavior. Fear of death, fear of loss, fear of exclusion, and fear of scarcity all serve to reinforce compliance and discourage deviation. These fears are not abstract concepts, but biological responses rooted in the body itself, responses that can be triggered, amplified, and manipulated through environmental conditions. A being that is constantly managing fear has limited capacity to question the system that generates it. Perhaps the most subtle limitation of all is the fragmentation of memory. Human societies repeatedly experience cycles of collapse and recovery, yet each recovery begins with little knowledge of what came before. Catastrophes erase records, languages evolve, and cultural continuity breaks down, leaving each generation to reconstruct meaning from incomplete fragments. Over time, this pattern creates the illusion of progress while obscuring the possibility that humanity has lived through similar cycles many times before. The Sumerian texts suggest that these limitations were not unforeseen consequences, but integral to the human role within the system. A workforce that is short-lived, perceptually limited, occupied with survival, and disconnected from its own past is far less likely to rebel than one that understands its origins and its potential. Control does not need to be enforced through constant intervention when it can be maintained through design. What makes these constraints particularly effective is that they are internalized. Humans do not experience them as external restrictions imposed by an authority, but as fundamental truths about reality. Time feels scarce. Work feels necessary. Fear feels justified. Forgetting feels inevitable. In this way, the system sustains itself without requiring visible enforcement because its parameters are built into the beings that maintain it. This perspective reframes many aspects of human life that are often taken for granted. The relentless pace of existence, the pressure to produce, the anxiety surrounding survival, and the difficulty of achieving sustained awareness all begin to resemble features of a controlled environment rather than random byproducts of evolution. When viewed collectively, these conditions form a coherent pattern, one that prioritizes stability and output over freedom and understanding. If humanity was designed to serve, then these limits are not flaws to be overcome, but mechanisms that ensure the continuation of that service. They keep humans focused on the immediate, distracted by necessity, and separated from the deeper question of why the system exists at all. The greatest constraint, then, is not physical or cognitive, but conceptual. Humans are rarely encouraged to imagine that their world could have been structured differently. In this light, the question of human potential becomes secondary to the question of human purpose. The Sumerian records do not suggest that humans lack capability, but that their capabilities are carefully bounded. They are strong enough to work, intelligent enough to solve problems, and adaptable enough to survive, yet not positioned to alter the system that defines their existence. Understanding these limits does not require accepting a single interpretation of ancient texts. It requires recognizing a pattern that persists across time, a pattern in which humanity operates within constraints that feel immutable precisely because they are so deeply ingrained. If these limits were written into the human design, then remembering that fact may be the first step toward understanding the world not as an inevitable reality, but as a structure with a history. If the idea that humanity was designed to serve feels unsettling, it is partly because it challenges the comfort of familiar explanations, yet it is also because certain details within the human story resist being fully explained by the narratives we have inherited. These details do not shout for attention, nor do they form a single coherent proof. Instead, they persist quietly at the edges of accepted knowledge, appearing as irregularities that are acknowledged but rarely explored in depth. They are not evidence of intent on their own, but they are reminders that the story of human origins may be incomplete. One of the most discussed of these irregularities lies within human biology itself. Modern genetics has provided extraordinary insight into how life changes over time, mapping patterns of inheritance with increasing precision. Yet even within this detailed framework, there are features of the human genome that stand apart, not because they defy evolution outright, but because they interrupt its expected flow. Certain genetic sequences appear without clear precursors, lacking the gradual progression typically observed across related species. These sequences function effectively, yet their origins remain uncertain, prompting explanations that rely on statistical rarity rather than continuity. Equally notable is the structure of the human genome when compared to that of other primates. Humans possess one fewer chromosome pair than their closest relatives, a difference that is widely attributed to a fusion event in the distant past. While this explanation is supported by physical markers within the chromosome itself, it also represents a dramatic structural change occurring at a critical point in human development. Such an event is not impossible, but its consequences are profound, altering reproductive compatibility and effectively isolating the human lineage from others. This isolation coincides with a period of rapid cognitive and behavioral change, a convergence that raises questions even if it does not provide definitive answers. Beyond genetics, the archaeological record reveals similar discontinuities. The emergence of complex behavior, symbolic expression, and advanced tool use appears abruptly rather than gradually, a phenomenon often referred to as the Great Leap Forward. For tens of thousands of years, human ancestors exhibit relatively stable patterns of behavior, followed by a comparatively sudden expansion in creativity, communication, and organization. This shift is real, documented, and widely acknowledged, yet its cause remains debated. Explanations range from neurological adaptation to environmental pressure, but none fully account for the speed and scale of the transformation. What is important about these anomalies is not that they prove external intervention, but that they resist simple resolution. Each one can be explained in isolation, yet taken together, they suggest a pattern of change that does not follow the slow, incremental rhythm typically associated with natural development. The human story contains moments of compression, points where complexity appears to condense into shorter spans of time than expected, leaving behind gaps that are filled with inference rather than direct evidence. These gaps are often treated as temporary shortcomings in knowledge, places where future research will eventually provide clarity. This may well be true. However, the persistence of these questions over decades of study suggests that they are not merely the result of missing data, but reflections of a deeper uncertainty about how to interpret the available evidence. The framework through which human origins are viewed influences which questions are asked and which possibilities are considered plausible. Within the context of the Sumerian narrative, these biological and archaeological irregularities take on a different tone. They do not function as confirmation of ancient claims, but as echoes, subtle alignments that make those claims more difficult to dismiss outright. If humanity was introduced into an existing system with specific requirements, then one would expect traces of adaptation, moments where form follows function rather than gradual exploration. Design does not require perfection, only sufficiency. It is also notable that these anomalies do not grant humanity unlimited capability. They do not result in extraordinary physical resilience or extended lifespan. Instead, they enhance cognitive flexibility, social coordination, and problem solving, precisely the traits required for sustained labor, organization, and environmental manipulation. The improvements are practical rather than liberating, optimized for participation rather than transcendence. This observation reinforces a recurring theme. The irregularities in the human record do not point toward a destiny of dominance or enlightenment, but toward suitability. Humanity appears uniquely positioned to maintain systems, to operate within structured environments, and to adapt behavior rapidly in response to external demands. These qualities are valuable, but they are also utilitarian. The reluctance to explore these anomalies beyond conventional boundaries is understandable, as doing so risks unsettling deeply held assumptions about autonomy and progress. Yet ignoring them entirely creates a different problem, one in which unresolved questions accumulate beneath the surface of accepted explanations. Over time, these questions begin to exert pressure, not because they demand a particular answer, but because they challenge the completeness of the story. The anomalies that persist in the human record do not accuse or explain, they simply remain. They suggest that something about the emergence of humanity does not align perfectly with expectations, and that this misalignment deserves attention rather than dismissal. Whether these irregularities point to intervention, convergence, or an as yet unrecognized process, they serve as reminders that the origin of humanity may not be as straightforward as it appears. In a system built on forgetting, such reminders are disruptive. They invite curiosity where certainty is preferred, and open questions where closure feels safer. They do not force belief, but they do encourage reconsideration, and in doing so, they keep alive the possibility that humanity's role in the world was shaped by factors that have yet to be fully remembered. If humanity inherited a world whose origins were already obscured, then the question of how memory was preserved becomes just as important as the events themselves. The Sumerians did not rely on oral tradition alone, nor did they encode their knowledge exclusively in symbolic myth. They pressed it into clay, creating a record that was intended to endure, and in doing so, they left behind one of the largest archives of human writing ever discovered. Tens of thousands of tablets have been excavated from the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, with estimates reaching into the hundreds of thousands when fragments are included. Yet only a small fraction of this material has been fully translated and integrated into modern historical understanding. This imbalance is often explained through practical limitations. Ancient languages are complex, trained specialists are few, and the process of translation is slow and meticulous. These explanations are valid, but they do not fully account for the patterns that emerge when the translated material is examined as a whole. The texts that receive the most attention tend to reinforce familiar narratives of kingship, ritual, and religion, while those that describe labor organization, resource management, and human obligation often remain peripheral. This selective focus shapes the story that modern readers inherit, emphasizing belief over function and symbolism over system. The act of translation itself introduces another layer of filtering. Words chosen by modern scholars carry assumptions about meaning, intent, and context, assumptions that may not align with the worldview of the original authors. Terms that could imply service, duty, or assignment are frequently softened into language of worship or devotion, subtly shifting the tone of the text. Over time, these choices accumulate, transforming records of obligation into stories of reverence and administrative descriptions into spiritual metaphors. What makes this particularly significant is that the Sumerians did not write as though they expected their texts to be reinterpreted thousands of years later. They wrote for continuity, for those who would come after them within the same cultural framework. Lists were precise, measurements exact, and roles clearly defined. These were not the kinds of texts one writes when inventing mythology. They resemble instructions, reports, and archives, preserved because they mattered to the operation of society. The libraries themselves reflect this purpose. Tablets were organized, categorized, and stored systematically, indicating that they were meant to be consulted rather than revered. They formed a reference system for a civilization that understood its survival depended on remembering how things were done. This emphasis on preservation suggests an awareness of fragility, a recognition that knowledge could be lost if not deliberately maintained. Yet despite this effort, fragmentation was inevitable. Tablets broke, cities fell, languages shifted. When modern archaeologists uncovered these archives, they did so without the cultural continuity that once gave them context. What remained were fragments of a much larger record, requiring reconstruction through interpretation rather than lived understanding. This gap between author and reader creates space for uncertainty, where meaning can be shaped as much by modern expectation as by ancient intent. The question then becomes not whether knowledge was hidden, but whether it was filtered through priorities that no longer aligned with its original purpose. When translation favors myth over mechanism, the resulting narrative becomes easier to integrate into existing frameworks, but harder to question. Stories of gods and creation are more comfortable than records of labor and design, because they reinforce familiar hierarchies rather than challenge them. This process of selective memory does not require deliberate suppression. It can occur naturally when certain interpretations feel safer, more marketable, or more compatible with prevailing beliefs. Over time, the less comfortable aspects of the record fade into obscurity, not because they are disproven, but because they are rarely revisited. The archive remains intact, yet its most disruptive implications remain unexplored. Within this context, the Sumerian tablets take on a new significance. They are not merely ancient artifacts, but repositories of a worldview that may not align with modern assumptions about human autonomy and progress. They suggest a society that understood itself as operating within a larger system, accountable to forces that were neither abstract nor moral, but administrative and functional. If humanity was designed to serve, then records describing duty and obligation would be central, not peripheral. The fact that such records exist, yet remain underemphasized, points to a broader pattern in how history is constructed. What is remembered is often what reinforces identity, while what challenges it is set aside. Translation in this sense is not just a linguistic act, but a cultural one. It determines which aspects of the past are allowed to speak and which remain silent. The libraries of clay have not been erased, but their voices have been softened, reshaped into stories that feel distant and symbolic rather than immediate and unsettling. To approach these texts without predetermined conclusions requires acknowledging this filter and recognizing that meaning may have been lost not through destruction, but through reinterpretation. The problem is not that the past is inaccessible, but that it has been made comfortable, and a comfortable history rarely reveals the structures that once governed human existence. When the Sumerian creation narratives are read without the expectation of poetry or allegory, their tone becomes strikingly unusual. These texts do not linger on awe, mystery, or divine transcendence. They are sparse, procedural, and at times almost indifferent to human emotion. Rather than celebrating the act of creation, they describe sequences of events, problems encountered, and solutions implemented, as though documenting a process rather than telling a story. This quality is what makes them feel less like myths in the traditional sense and more like records that were never intended to inspire belief, only to preserve information. The Enuma Elish, often introduced as a myth of cosmic beginnings, contains passages that read more like descriptions of organization and restructuring than expressions of spiritual revelation. The text focuses on conflict resolution, the division of authority, and the establishment of order through hierarchy. The language emphasizes function over meaning, describing how roles are assigned and responsibilities distributed. Even the formation of the world is framed not as an act of wonder, but as the outcome of a series of adjustments made to stabilize a larger system. Similarly, the Atrahasis epic presents a narrative that centers on labor, workload, and operational failure. The junior gods assigned to maintain the earth express exhaustion and frustration, and their rebellion is portrayed not as a moral uprising, but as a practical refusal to continue under existing conditions. The response to this crisis is not divine punishment or philosophical reflection, but a search for an alternative workforce. The creation of humanity emerges from this context as a technical solution to an organizational problem. What is notably absent from these texts is reverence toward humans themselves. Humanity is not described as sacred or exceptional, but as useful. The process of creation involves experimentation, with early attempts producing beings that are unstable, infertile, or incapable of performing their assigned tasks. These failures are recorded without drama, as though documenting prototypes that did not meet specifications. Only after refinement does a version emerge that functions as intended, and even then, the emphasis remains on performance rather than purpose. The language used to describe this process reinforces the impression of documentation rather than myth-making. Terms associated with work, burden, and assignment appear repeatedly, while words associated with worship or devotion are secondary. The gods do not seek admiration from humanity, nor do they instruct humans to contemplate their origins. Instead, humans are placed into the environment and given responsibilities, with the expectation that they will fulfill their role without question. This procedural tone challenges modern assumptions about ancient storytelling. Myths are often expected to convey values, explain morality, or offer comfort in the face of uncertainty. The Sumerian narratives do none of these things. They do not explain why the system exists, only how it operates. They do not justify the hierarchy they describe, nor do they question it. They simply record it. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. These texts may not have been written to be believed in the way modern religions are believed. They may have been written to be remembered, serving as internal records for a society that understood its place within a much larger framework. If this is the case, then their lack of symbolism is not a failure of imagination, but a reflection of intent. The absence of moral framing also suggests that the authors did not see the events they recorded as requiring justification. The creation of humanity is not presented as an ethical dilemma, but as a necessary adjustment to ensure stability. The gods do not debate whether humans should exist, only how they should function. This perspective aligns more closely with system management than with theology. When read in this light, the discomfort these texts evoke is understandable. They strip away the comforting layers of meaning that later cultures added and reveal a narrative that is indifferent to human self-importance. Humanity exists because it was needed, not because it was desired. Its value lies in what it does, not in what it represents. This interpretation does not require rejecting all symbolic readings of ancient myth, but it does require acknowledging that not all myths were intended to function as moral allegories. Some may have been closer to archives, preserving information that later generations would struggle to interpret once the original context was lost. If the Sumerian creation stories sound like technical reports, it may be because they were never meant to inspire devotion. They were meant to document a process that was already complete by the time humans became aware of it. In a world where memory was already fading, these texts may have served as the last structured reminders of how the system came to include humanity at all. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, stories of a great flood appear with striking consistency, often described as a moment when the world was cleansed, reset, or remade. These narratives are commonly interpreted as moral lessons, warnings about divine judgment, or symbolic representations of natural disaster. Yet when examined through the lens of continuity rather than catastrophe, the flood takes on a different significance, not merely as an event that destroyed physical structures, but as a rupture that severed memory itself. In the Sumerian tradition, the flood is not portrayed as the beginning of humanity, but as an interruption in an ongoing story. The world existed before it, systems were already in place, and human society was functioning within established constraints. The flood does not create order from chaos. It interrupts order and then allows it to resume in diminished form. What follows is not a new world, but a continuation stripped of its depth, a reality that remembers less than what came before. This distinction is crucial because destruction alone does not erase knowledge. Cities can be rebuilt, populations can recover, and tools can be remade. Memory, however, is far more fragile. It relies on continuity, on uninterrupted transmission across generations. When that chain is broken, the result is not simply loss, but distortion. Fragments remain, but their context disappears, leaving later societies to reconstruct meaning from incomplete remnants. The flood narratives often include a deliberate act of preservation, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a warning given in secret. This element suggests that the erasure was not absolute but selective. Some knowledge was allowed to pass through the rupture, while the majority was left behind. Those who emerged after the flood inherited a world that still functioned, but no longer understood why it was structured the way it was. In Sumerian texts, the decision to preserve humanity is not framed as an act of compassion toward humans themselves, but as a compromise between competing authorities. One faction seeks to eliminate the disturbance humans have become, while another chooses to maintain them as a necessary component of the system. Humanity survives not because it is innocent, but because it remains useful. This survival, however, comes at the cost of awareness. The continuity of memory is broken, ensuring that those who remain cannot challenge the system they are embedded within. This interpretation reframes the flood as a mechanism of control rather than a moral correction. By resetting population and erasing accumulated knowledge, the system eliminates the risk of human self-awareness growing beyond acceptable limits. Each cycle begins anew, with humanity rediscovering techniques, rebuilding societies, and relearning patterns of labor, all while remaining unaware that these cycles have occurred before. Evidence of this pattern can be seen in the repeated emergence of advanced knowledge followed by collapse across human history. Complex societies arise, reach levels of organization and technical sophistication that appear premature, and then vanish, leaving behind ruins that later cultures struggle to explain. Each time the narrative resets, treating the survivors as the beginning rather than the continuation of a much older process. The flood therefore represents more than environmental catastrophe. It marks a boundary beyond which memory does not pass. Before the flood, the texts describe direct interaction, longer lifespans, and clearer understanding of humanity's role. After it, interaction becomes distant, authority becomes abstract, and human history contracts into shorter spans with limited perspective. The system remains, but its operators become less informed. This loss of continuity has profound consequences. Without memory of origin, humanity interprets its condition as natural. Labor becomes necessity rather than assignment. Limitation becomes biology rather than design. Hierarchy becomes tradition rather than structure. The world feels inevitable because its history has been truncated. Flood myths persist because the trauma they represent was never fully processed. They are echoes of a rupture that reshaped human consciousness, embedded in story, because direct memory was no longer accessible. Each retelling preserves the outline of the event while obscuring its function, turning a mechanism of erasure into a moral tale. If the flood erased continuity rather than existence, then its most lasting effect was not destruction, but forgetting. Humanity survived, but without the knowledge required to understand why it existed in the form it did. The system continued, now safer from disruption, because those within it no longer remembered that it had ever been different. Seen this way, the flood stands not as an isolated disaster, but as a turning point in the relationship between humanity and memory. It marks the moment when history became fragmented, when origin became myth, and when service could continue without explanation. What followed was not ignorance, but a controlled rediscovery, one that ensured humanity would rebuild the world without ever remembering who designed it. When the idea of a prison is introduced, it often conjures images of walls, guards, and visible confinement, yet the most effective systems of control rarely rely on such overt measures. They function by shaping perception rather than restricting movement, by defining what feels possible rather than enforcing what is forbidden. If the world humanity inhabits is a system designed for continuity and maintenance, then any form of containment would not need to be physical in the traditional sense. It would need only to limit awareness. In this context, the prison is not a place but a condition. It is embedded in the structure of reality as experienced by human beings. Gravity anchors bodies to the surface of the planet, not merely as a physical force, but as a constraint that defines the boundaries of movement and exploration. Survival depends on remaining within narrow environmental tolerances, binding human attention to immediate needs and local concerns. This dependency creates a feedback loop in which energy is continually expended simply to remain alive, leaving little surplus for sustained reflection on the nature of the system itself. Biology reinforces this containment. Human bodies are resilient enough to endure labor, but fragile enough to require constant care. Pain, hunger, fatigue, and illness are not occasional interruptions, but persistent features of existence that demand attention. These sensations ensure that focus remains directed inward toward survival, rather than outward toward inquiry. A being preoccupied with maintaining its body is less likely to question the framework within which that body operates. Psychology adds another layer. Fear of death, fear of loss, fear of exclusion, and fear of uncertainty shape decision-making at every level of society. These fears are deeply rooted in biology, yet they are amplified by social structures that reward conformity and penalize deviation. The desire for security becomes a powerful motivator, encouraging individuals to accept systems that promise stability even when those systems impose significant constraints. Over time, this trade-off becomes normalized, and the boundaries of the prison are mistaken for the limits of reality itself. Perhaps the most effective aspect of this containment is its invisibility. Humans are rarely told that they are confined. Instead, they are taught that the world simply is the way it is. Work is framed as virtue. Endurance is framed as strength. Obedience is framed as responsibility. These values are internalized from an early age, becoming part of identity rather than external impositions. When individuals police their own behavior in accordance with system needs, overt enforcement becomes unnecessary. The absence of visible jailers does not mean the absence of control. It means control has been delegated. Human societies organize themselves around structures that demand continuous productivity, competition, and growth, often without questioning who benefits from this arrangement. The system sustains itself through participation, drawing energy from the very beings it constrains. In this sense, the prison does not need to be defended. It is maintained willingly by those inside it. Ancient traditions hint at this form of containment through metaphors rather than direct statements. References to cycles of rebirth, traps of forgetting, and veils over perception appear across cultures, suggesting an intuitive awareness that something about human experience is restricted. These ideas are often dismissed as spiritual abstraction, yet they reflect a persistent intuition that freedom is not merely a matter of physical movement, but of awareness. Within the framework established by the Sumerian texts, such containment would be both logical and efficient. A workforce designed to maintain a system does not need to be confined by force if its members do not conceive of alternatives. By limiting perception, shortening lifespan, and fragmenting memory, the system ensures continuity without resistance. The prison becomes indistinguishable from reality. This interpretation also sheds light on why human progress often feels paradoxical. Technological advancement increases capability, yet rarely leads to greater autonomy. Instead, new tools tend to deepen dependency, integrating individuals more tightly into existing structures. Efficiency improves, but freedom does not expand proportionally. The system evolves, but its fundamental logic remains unchanged. If this is a prison, then its bars are not made of stone or steel, but of assumptions. Assumptions about what is possible, what is necessary, and what is worth questioning. These assumptions shape behavior more effectively than any wall because they operate internally, guiding choices without the need for external constraint. Recognizing this does not require accepting a single theory or belief. It requires observing how the world functions and asking whether its structure serves human flourishing or merely human participation. If the system prioritizes maintenance over understanding, then the question is not how to escape it physically, but how to perceive it clearly. A prison remains effective only as long as it is unrecognized. The moment its structure becomes visible, its power begins to weaken. If humanity is indeed operating within a system it did not design, then the first act of resistance is not rebellion, but awareness. And awareness begins with the willingness to consider that the boundaries of human experience may have been defined long before humans were capable of questioning them. Across the surface of the planet are structures that sit uncomfortably within the timeline humanity has constructed for itself, remnants of technical ability and organizational capacity that appear long before the societies officially credited with developing them. These sites are often described as anomalies, outliers that challenge expectations but are ultimately absorbed into the broader narrative through revision, speculation, or dismissal. Yet taken together, they form a pattern that suggests the human past may not be as linear or as simple as it is often portrayed. Massive stone constructions appear in regions where the tools required to create them are said not to exist. Blocks weighing hundreds or even thousands of tons are quarried, transported, and fitted with precision that remains difficult to replicate even with modern technology. The question is not merely how these feats were accomplished, but why similar techniques seem to appear and disappear across different cultures and time periods without clear lines of transmission. If knowledge develops gradually, it should leave a trail. In many cases, that trail is absent. The precision found in these ancient sites is particularly striking. Stones are cut and joined with tolerances so fine that even thin blades cannot pass between them. Yet there is little evidence of the intermediate stages that would indicate a long period of experimentation. Instead, advanced methods appear suddenly, are applied consistently, and then vanish. Later cultures often build upon or around these structures without understanding how they were made, treating them as inherited foundations rather than achievements of their own. This pattern aligns with the idea of inheritance rather than invention. Just as the Sumerians appear to have received knowledge they did not originate, these builders may have operated within a framework that already existed, using techniques passed down from an earlier source rather than developed independently. When that source disappeared, the knowledge faded, leaving behind monuments without manuals. Geographical separation does little to disrupt this pattern. Similar construction principles appear across continents, suggesting either a level of global communication far beyond what is acknowledged or a shared inheritance from a much older system. Alignments with celestial bodies, precise measurements, and consistent symbolic motifs hint at a unified understanding of the world that transcended local culture. This understanding does not require advanced machinery, but it does require coordination, planning, and a level of knowledge that challenges conventional timelines. What makes these sites particularly difficult to integrate into mainstream history is not their existence, but their implication. If humans were capable of such feats earlier than expected, then the narrative of steady progress becomes unstable. Either humanity repeatedly achieved and lost advanced knowledge, or it inherited fragments of a system that predated recorded history. Both possibilities undermine the idea that civilization emerged only once from primitive beginnings. The reluctance to fully explore these implications is understandable, as doing so would require re-examining foundational assumptions about human development. It is easier to attribute anomalies to coincidence, lost techniques, or exaggerated interpretation than to consider that the timeline itself may be incomplete. Yet the persistence of these structures suggests that they are not isolated mistakes in the record, but signals pointing toward a deeper continuity that has been overlooked. Within the framework established earlier, these builders may not represent an evolutionary anomaly, but a functional one. If humanity was introduced into a pre-existing system, then early societies may have had access to guidance, knowledge, or templates that were later withdrawn. Once that support was gone, humans continued to maintain what remained, but without the understanding required to reproduce it. Over time, the memory of how these structures were created faded, leaving only the physical evidence behind. These monuments do not declare who built them or why. They do not carry inscriptions explaining their methods or intentions. They simply exist, resisting attempts to place them neatly within a linear story. Their silence is what makes them unsettling. They suggest capability without context, achievement without explanation. If history is the record of what is remembered, then these structures represent what was forgotten. They stand as reminders that humanity's past may include chapters that do not align with accepted chronology, chapters that hint at a level of organization and knowledge that contradicts the idea of a slow ascent from ignorance. The builders who created these sites should not exist according to the timelines that dominate modern understanding. Yet their work remains, challenging the notion that humanity's role in the world has always been limited by the same constraints. Whether these builders were early humans with access to lost knowledge or participants in a system that no longer operates openly, their presence suggests that the story of service and inheritance extends deeper into the past than commonly acknowledged. By the time humanity reaches the present moment, the system it inhabits feels so complete that questioning it appears impractical rather than dangerous. Work defines time. Survival defines value. Progress is measured by output rather than understanding. Within such a framework, the idea that humanity may have been designed to serve does not arrive as a shock, but as an uncomfortable recognition, because it resembles lived experience more closely than many are willing to admit. If the ancient record suggests anything, it is not that humanity is powerless, but that its power has been directed inward, toward maintenance rather than transformation. The systems humans sustain today bear a striking resemblance to those described in the earliest texts: hierarchies of authority, cycles of labor, and expectations of compliance that persist regardless of cultural context. What has changed is not the structure, but the narrative surrounding it. Service is no longer framed as obligation to gods, but as participation in society, progress, or survival itself. This shift in narrative is significant because it removes the need for overt control. When individuals believe that their roles are natural or self-chosen, enforcement becomes unnecessary. The system is upheld voluntarily, reinforced by shared assumptions about what constitutes a meaningful life. In this environment, the idea of rebellion feels misplaced, even childish, because there is no visible oppressor to oppose, only a world that appears to function as it always has. Yet remembering is not rebellion. To remember is simply to observe that the present did not emerge spontaneously, that it carries the imprint of earlier designs and forgotten decisions. Remembering does not require rejecting society or withdrawing from participation. It requires recognizing that participation itself has a history, one that may not align with the values humanity currently projects onto it. The Sumerian texts do not instruct humans to overthrow their creators or dismantle the system they describe. They do something far subtler. They preserve a record of how humanity came to occupy its role, a record that becomes increasingly difficult to interpret as memory fades. The discomfort these texts evoke arises not from their content, but from their tone. They speak without apology, without justification, and without concern for how humans might feel about the roles assigned to them. This indifference is revealing. It suggests that the system never required human approval to function. It required only participation. As long as humanity continues to work, reproduce, and maintain the environment it inherited, the system remains stable. Awareness is optional. Memory is unnecessary. In this context, the greatest act of defiance is not resistance, but perception. To see the system as a system is to loosen its hold, not by escaping it, but by understanding its logic. A system that depends on forgetting becomes vulnerable when memory returns, even partially, not because it collapses, but because it can no longer rely on unquestioned compliance. The fear that often accompanies such reflection is understandable. If humanity was designed to serve, then remembering that fact can feel like an erosion of dignity or purpose. Yet dignity does not arise from ignorance, and purpose imposed without understanding is indistinguishable from obligation. True autonomy begins not with freedom of movement, but with clarity of awareness. The question that remains is not whether ancient beings still watch, return, or intervene. Those questions, while compelling, may distract from the more immediate reality. The system does not require overseers if it is self-sustaining. It does not require guardians if its participants enforce its rules upon themselves. The most efficient system is one that no longer needs to be actively managed. If this world was once designed for service, it may no longer need designers. It continues because humanity continues it. Each generation inherits the structure, learns to operate within it, and passes it on, rarely pausing to ask why it exists or whom it ultimately serves. The prison, if it can be called that, persists not because it is locked, but because it feels like reality. Remembering does not mean abandoning the world. It means seeing it clearly. It means recognizing that many of the limits accepted as natural may have historical origins, and that those origins were shaped by needs that no longer exist or never belonged to humanity in the first place. Memory reintroduces choice, even if that choice is uncomfortable. The Sumerians did not leave behind a call to action. They left behind a question, preserved in clay and carried forward through fragments and translation. That question is not whether humanity was created by gods or advanced beings, but whether humanity has mistaken function for fate. If humanity was designed to serve in a world that forgot its true origin, then remembering that origin is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of orientation. It does not demand escape, but awareness. And awareness, once achieved, cannot be easily undone. The system may continue. Humanity may continue within it. But the moment memory returns, even faintly, participation becomes a choice rather than an assumption. That shift, however subtle, changes everything. If this exploration resonated with you, feel free to like the video, share it with anyone you think might find these questions meaningful, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to continue exploring forgotten histories and deeper patterns together. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows this space for reflection to keep growing. Thank you for being here.